I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome back to the Sky News Daily. Now, following on from yesterday's episode focusing on the Diane Abbott racism row, a little later we will be returning to Westminster to hear about the government's new definition of extremism.
What's happened today in the Commons, I think, is incredibly important, and it's going to have ramifications for years to come. It's technical, it's complex, but it's not what people think.
But first, let's rewind to March 2003 and the beginning of the Iraq War. Among the British forces present were soldiers from the RAF regiment. In the months that followed, the best part of 100 of them were tasked with protecting the Qarmat Ali water treatment plant, servicing one of the oil fields, considered critical to getting production up and running, once, of course, Saddam had been toppled. The US-led coalition appointed contractors KBR to manage the site. The British soldiers protected them, yet there was no protection for the RAF from the toxic chemical sodium dichromate that literally littered the site. And it is alleged that the contractors and others knew of the potentially deadly carcinogen, and, having suffered multiple health problems for more than 2 decades, the soldiers now want answers.
The departments and governments involved clearly knew what was at Qarmat Ali, and we were expendable. And nobody now wants to admit that, take responsibility, or do what's right to give us justice.
The charge is incredibly serious, that British troops were knowingly exposed to a deadly compound that causes cancer. We have a US Defence Department report suggesting that KBR became aware of sodium dichromate in May 2003, the military task force in June, but that safety procedures only started to be followed in August. Indeed, a case was brought against KBR in the United States by members of its National Guard, and they were successful, but the decision was overturned on appeal. Let's get to the bottom of this. Michael Drummond is Sky's foreign news reporter, and he's the chap responsible for the story. Take us back to 2003, the beginning of the Iraq War, and of course, what exactly was going on at the Qarmat Ali water treatment plant.
You have a group of around 88 RAF soldiers who were deployed in and around Basra, and they rotated around different sites to guard.
Infrastructure security.
Yeah, so like Basra Airport and other places, and one of them was this chemical site. It's a water treatment facility called Qarmat Ali. On the face of it, you wouldn't think that that was something that soldiers had to guard, but it was critical to getting Iraqi oil flowing again. This site would pump water down into pipes underneath sort of the oil fields nearby, which would then push up the oil to the surface, and that was how they got the oil. So you had these teams of sort of 7, 8 RAF soldiers who would rotate, and they'd spend 24 hours on the site, living, eating there, guarding it, so that they could have protection for workers that would be escorted to and from the site on day trips to work there and operate it.
Sounds like a straightforward gig. Turned out to be anything but.
No, well, what they didn't know is that this chemical site was contaminated. You had thousands of these bags, we're told, of what turned out to be sodium dichromate.
You're going to have to explain what sodium dichromate actually is.
It's this orange powder, right? And they use it to stop corrosion in pipes. It's really toxic. It's part of this family called hexavalent chromium, which listeners may know from the Aaron Brockovich film, because it was another compound from that same family. But yes, you had the sodium dichromate, not only in bags, things that were torn open and just blowing in the wind. So it was everywhere. It's quite old-fashioned, a chemical. It's no longer used in the UK and the EU and the US because it's so toxic. You know, they talk about the effect of a grain of sand of this stuff. It is carcinogenic, as the soldiers have told us. At the time, they experienced symptoms that were consistent with exposure to this, and to this day are having illnesses and health problems that they think are linked to it. We're not talking about something that's just, in the water or whatever. This is a powder in the air, in the desert. It's almost the same colour as the sand. Like, you can just see it's orange on top of the sand and it's blowing in the wind. We have soldiers talked about how they would see it get on their food as they ate.
Did no one know that sodium dichromate was, literally everywhere?
I mean, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
They had a whole big Department of Defense inquiry in the US to try and figure out exactly who knew what and when. The site was operated by contractors KBR. They were appointed by the US military to run this site to get the oil going. According to the US inquiry, KBR knew as early as the end of May 2003 that the oil company that had run the site had used sodium dichromate. And then by later in June 2003, it seems that KBR and the US military task force that were running this operation knew that it was the possible contamination. In August, 2 people in hazmat suits, coveralls and respirators, full chemical gear, or it looks like anyway, come onto the site and they put up a sign in English and Arabic warning of sodium dichromate exposure and the fact this is really toxic.
By this point, we know that some of the RAF soldiers who'd been stationed to Qarmat Ali had already started to experience the effects.
These guys are used to combat ops, so they're not going to always worry about what they think might be minor symptoms at the time.
Over the years since, the more than 20 years that there has been since 2003, we understand that there have been longer term effects.
We've spoken to 10 UK veterans. 9 of them have had ongoing health issues ranging from rashes or skin lesions to one person had his nose would bleed every day to the point where he had to be hospitalised overnight, staying that night in A&E just to stop the bleeding. And unfortunately, 3 guys have been diagnosed with cancer in the meantime and been treated for that. One had a brain tumour. It's hard to say, this was caused by The science is difficult, but certainly there have been studies that hypothesise that it can cause cancers or be involved.
Chain of command in situations like this is really important. Who was in charge of the Qarmat Ali site?
It was run as part of Task Force Rio, Restore Iraqi Oil. This was a US engineer military task force. These big contractors, KBR, were appointed to run the site. These workers who would operate the site would be escorted by US troops on day trips to the site, where they would then operate the site under guard of the British military. That's how you see American troops that are caught up in this as well. And even after this sign went up, they weren't given respirators or coveralls, despite the fact that the sign says full protective equipment and chemical respirator required.
I'm just struggling to understand why this chemical, clearly dangerous, was not contained in any form.
I think that's the major question. And, I've trawled through the US inquiry. I've spoken to 10 of these veterans now and the lawyer who represented them. The answer is still unclear. These guys gave years of their lives, decades. They served in Iraq, in other combat theatres. Some served in Northern Ireland, in Bosnia. These guys gave their service to their country, as they put it. And some of them look back and think, well, why weren't we taken care of?
Well, let's speak to one of those, featuring in your reporting, Michael. Andy Tosh was a sergeant in the RAF regiment. Andy, thanks very much for being with us. Take me back to 2003 and that first time that you and your comrades arrived at Qarmat Ali.
I was a sergeant at the time, and that site was important to ensure that high-pressure water was pumped into the southern Iraqi oil fields so that oil could still flow on a daily basis. There was bomb damage, there was burnt-out buildings, then there were chemicals on the ground, numerous bags of different chemicals that we paid little attention to because we were looking more for operational military-type threats and defensive positions and things like that. Facilities were very basic, a portaloo, no external fence that had already been destroyed. So quite a large chemical plant with numerous buildings, roads through it, lots of different soil, sand. It was a very dry environment, no trees.
At first glance, this looked like a bread and butter gig for you and your colleagues.
Around August time, whilst I was at Qarmat Ali with my small section, we seen KBR workers show up in Tyvek suits and respirators. And actually, where we were sat, they hammered up a sign with a skull and crossbones on, written in English and in Arabic, saying sodium dichromate, toxic chemical.
That was the first that you had heard of this compound, sodium dichromate?
Correct. I've operated all around the world, hot tropical climates, the Arctic. I've never had a rash like I had on my forearms.
You and your colleagues continued to work at this site without hazmat suits, without hazardous materials, protective clothing on?
The mitigating circumstances that were initially put in was to put up some mine tape, like a police cordon piece of tape. You can imagine for a chemical that's blown around in the dust and littering everywhere, not really the outcomes we would expect from our employer, who were the RAF and the MOD. I'm sure anyone who's got a health and safety background will know if there's a risk of exposure that you remove the risk, as in either take the chemical away or you take the individuals away. Neither happened. So we continued to stay there. And at no time were we offered any medical monitoring or health checks, nothing at all. Some of my colleagues had red eyes, sore eyes, throat infections. Some of the soldiers had nosebleeds. But prior to us now knowing what the symptoms of sodium dichromate are, we had no idea. We thought it might be the temperature, maybe it's the environment. I mean, some days it was 52 degrees. That's in the shade. This has been a scandal. It's outrageous what has happened. And to a degree, it's sort of similar to the post office scandal, with so much has gone on with nobody taking responsibility. And where we've tried to highlight our predicament, we haven't actually got anywhere. Some of the KBR workers and the National Guards were offered blood tests to see what heavy particles might be in their bloods. And obviously there's a timeline to do things like that. We got offered nothing. So we did our full tour at Qarmat Ali. 5 months, never got taken off the site. It was fully operational. We returned to the UK in October in 2003. The following year, a very junior RAF officer came to brief some of us that were still on the squadron, because obviously staff had moved around or been promoted or left the Air Force. And we got a handout given which stated chromium and U, and that it was a class A carcinogen that causes cancers, highly toxic, and that, we may have been exposed. Not everyone got briefed. We should have been offered the medical monitoring and tests at the time of the exposure. A lot of the younger colleagues that I was responsible for, many of them have underlying health issues. Some of those are quite serious, severe cancers. If the MOD want to support us, they need to hold the contractor accountable. They also obviously need to admit that they didn't follow through with the duty of care for us working on a chemical site in Iraq.
I wonder then, Andy, who you are more angry with, KBR or the Ministry of Defence?
21 years later, we still haven't got any justice, just even an outcome or admittance that, we messed up. For me, it is the MOD. To a degree, governments are involved. A public inquiry is really what we need and the British public need to hear to see what's gone on, because it's outrageous. It's what occurred in 2003, but it's what has continued to occur.
I presume in and of itself, a meeting with officials at the Ministry of Defence isn't enough for you.
It's not. My interpretation is the departments and governments involved clearly knew what was at Qarmat Ali, and we were expendable. And nobody now wants to admit that, take responsibility, or do what's right to give us justice.
Thank you, Andy. Michael Drummond is still here. Michael, it's pretty difficult not to be moved by what we've just heard. So what exactly are the main players saying? Let's start with the contractors, KBR.
We went to them for comment with this story and put our points across. And they said the company was performing work at the direction of the US Army under the extreme and continually evolving conditions of wartime Iraq. KBR abided by the war zone chain of command. KBR reasonably, timely, and repeatedly notified the US Army of sodium dichromate at the facility upon discovering it and acted promptly to address it. All of these claims made against KBR were dismissed by US courts.
All of which now begs the question, what are we hearing domestically? You would have thought the Veterans Minister might have something to say about this. If not him, then certainly the Ministry of Defence. The
Ministry of Defence have also issued a statement in response to our investigation. They said they're willing to meet with the British veterans to see what they have to say, which is certainly more than has happened in the last 20 years. So they said, as soon as we were alerted to the possible exposure of sodium dichromate, an environmental survey was conducted to evaluate typical exposure at Qarmat Ali. They go on to say, anyone who requires medical treatment can receive it through the Defence Medical Services and other appropriate services. I mean, I would add on to that lots of these guys want to have proactive monitoring, trying to see what's going on before it becomes a real problem, rather than, having to just wait until something goes wrong.
Michael, thank you. And of course, we will continue to monitor developments in this story. I have a suspicion that we will be hearing much more from the MOD in future. But let's take a breather. We will be back in a moment with our Deputy Political Editor to hear how the government is redefining extremism. See you in a sec. Welcome back. Now, on yesterday's podcast, our Deputy Political Editor and I took a good old look at the ongoing racism row over the Conservative donor Frank Hester and his comments about Diane Abbott, which of course took on even more significance as the government, in the shape of Michael Gove, was preparing to announce its new definition of extremism. Yep, appropriately enough, just like comedy, in politics, timing is everything. We have now heard from the Community Secretary in the Commons, so we have asked Sam Coates back on the podcast to explain exactly what is going on. Sam, good to see you. What exactly is going on?
What's happened today in the Commons, I think, is incredibly important, and it's going to have ramifications for years to come. It's technical, it's complex, but it's not what people think. Let me explain. The government are doing two things. The first is to broaden the definition of what they think amounts to extremism. It's a change for sure, but it was quite broad. It is even broader, but ultimately these things were pretty flexible anyway. The difference is something else, and I think it's going to make a profound change. For the first time, Michael Gove told the Commons that governments are going to produce lists of people who basically fall foul of this new definition of extremism. In other words, they're going to produce documents that are on the Parliament website of organisations that have the official stamp of extremism by their name. Now, in actual practical terms, what it means to be on this list might not sound like very much. It's not a legal definition. It's got nothing to do with banned organisations. All it does is it means that if you're on the list, you can't get public money and you can't meet with central government officials, ministers and the like. Now, that is a small thing, not least because many of these organisations weren't meeting with government ministers and getting public money right. But actually, Neil, I want to argue to you today that it's huge for this reason. If your organisation or you appear on a list produced by HM government of extremists, your life is going to change. Would you, as a bank, offer a loan to an organisation that is on a government's extremist list? Would you, the US government, offer a visa to somebody who's on an official government extremist list? Would you offer services to an organisation that's on an extremist list? It is a completely different, new, quite innovative, quite clever and massively controversial approach to this technique and this subject that effectively amounts to publicly naming and shaming, publicly feathering and tarring a group of people that politicians have decided fall foul of their definition of extremism. What could possibly go wrong?
Explain exactly how this will work. What is the test? Who has the ability to make this declaration of extremism? How do people appeal against it?
The key thing you've got to understand is that it is entirely a political decision who's on the list and not. Right. So officials in government in Whitehall will draw up recommendations, but it is ultimately for the Levelling Up Secretary and the Home Secretary, so that's Michael Gove and James Cleverly, to determine whether or not they accept or reject the recommendation of the organisations being placed on this list. If you are placed on that list, the only recourse to justice is a judicial review in the High Court. Costly, expensive, difficult. Yeah. Undoubtedly, there will be some that do it, possibly some that don't.
And judicial review, people who haven't, like me, done a law degree, a judicial review is not on the merits of the decision. It is just whether or not the politician, the Secretary of State, has acted ultra vires, has acted outside of their powers in arriving at that decision. So it's not even a proper appeals process, really.
No, and I think they're deliberately trying to curtail any attempt at appeal. And whether or not the courts find other ways of accepting challenges on this will be an interesting moot point. But Neil, it has to be a political judgment, because my argument to you is that all definitions and all judgments of whether or not somebody's gone too far are political, because essentially they're in the eye of the beholder. It is very, very hard when stuff is not illegal to work out where it crosses the line.
Let's just be absolutely clear about this. We are talking about branding organisations as extremists who have committed no crimes.
That is correct. Do you know what's fascinating, Neil? The government have been working on this for months. 4 months. And yet, on the day that they launched their strategy in the Commons, amid much fanfare, they haven't been able to produce the lists. There are a few organisations that Michael Gove said in the Commons, I'm not going to repeat them, that they are going to test them against the new definition to see if they fall foul of it. However, there are no lists. And that is because, funnily enough, doing this stuff is hard. It's got gummed up in, inside the government machine. I am told lists are coming in weeks, not months. But I know there are opponents in governments to this who think that we're going down an incredibly dangerous route, because It is so hard to judge whether or not an organisation or individuals who say that they are part of an organisation, but it's not clear who are full members, who are associate members, who's part of it. It is so hard to determine in a binary fashion whether or not this extraordinarily potent and kind of shaming label should be applied.
This is where I have to admit I am scratching my head, Sam, and I'll tell you why I think you haven't had a list today. And I don't want to get all Orwellian about it, looking from man to pig and pig to man. But when politicians are the ultimate arbiters of this, the list is the definition. The definition is the list.
100%. And although Michael Gove sort of outlined the new definition, he also revealed that there are sort of hundreds of pages of guidance sitting beneath the definition. Like, in other words, there is more to the definition than the definition itself. That's where you're completely right. But let me tell you why defining extremism and defining extremes is so hard through two examples that politicians struggled with. One was Rishi Sunak struggling with Lee Anderson and whether those comments cross the threshold of being extreme. And then look at the controversy at the moment with Frank Hester, the Tory donor, the Tory sort of biggest current donor. And the Prime Minister there deciding that, yes, his comments were racist. Surely that is a form of extremism, but also the quality of his apology means that we should accept his remorse and therefore the Tories can keep taking more money from him, right? So immediately at a stroke, you've got two examples where it has proved much harder than you might want to come up with a binary, yes, this is extreme, or no, it's not. This strategy wants to roll out those kind of choices across society to the hardest possible areas to make determinations about. Organisations, are they official registered groups? How do we know the memberships? Who do we think will be tarred by an organisation's name being listed as an extremist? Is there consequence for the people who are associated with it? What happens if people are accidentally associated with an extreme organisation? It's an absolute ruddy minefield. These are fine judgments in complex areas where you're essentially having to police motive and effectively thought rather than action. I just really struggle to see how it works in practice.
Why, if all these ducks are not in a row right now, are the government deciding to announce it right now in the manner in which they've done?
Let me attempt the sort of case for the defence. I think a lot of voters will have quite a lot of sympathy for this. The problem with the extremism debate often in years gone past is people have been too cautious. They've seen all the nuances, the arguments, the legal threats, the uncertainty, and that has led people to duck what some Tories would like to say is sort of calling a spade, and providing clarity where politicians can make clear judgments about stuff that is bad. It's no bad thing. And in a context where you're seeing problems around community cohesion, particularly in the aftermath of the October attacks, that potentially there is support.
So what is the politics of all of this, Sam, in an election year?
Today, Michael Gove, he has said that we will tackle all sides equally. But there is a suspicion in Labour that is shared amongst members of the Conservative government that the medium-term aim of this is slightly narrower party politics. Let me explain. But when these lists finally emerge, will it be the case that you might just find that some shadow ministers, some Labour councillors, some members of the Welsh Labour administration had been palling around with groups that are now officially tagged on the government website as extremists. You could see a tabloid Sunday newspaper headline, look at Shadow Minister X, Labour's, big beast Y, here with this person that nobody could question as an extremist because the government says it is. Right? Is that the entire point of what's going on now? They think that an element of this ultimately is going to be repurposed as a political weapon. But in order to do that, it is even more important that today you hear none of it. And Michael Gove looks like the kind of, like he floats above politics, just helping shepherd what are obvious judgments that everybody should be able to agree with between good and bad, right and wrong. Let's come back to this in 3 months if the lists have emerged to see how the lists have ended up being used.
Thank you, Sam. Now, it isn't difficult to see why the redefinition of extremism is making headlines, not least the consequences for those who end up on Michael Gove's little list. So too the fact that the activity described as extremist wouldn't necessarily have to break any laws. And here's the thing. As currently described, The new system does not have a proper appeals process. Therefore, the new definition of extremism is whatever the politicians say it is, which some of us might describe as the very definition of troubling. That's your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll see you next time.